He's not okay, and I fear he won't be for a long time. That's what Prince William said. Not in a press conference, not in a staged interview, but in a quiet moment behind a hospital curtain when no palace aide was listening, or so he thought. And it shook the monarchy. Let that settle in for a second, because what you're about to hear isn't polished PR. This isn't the version you'll get on the royal website or in glossy tabloids with smiling portraits and sterile press statements. No, this is the version they didn't want you to know. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This is the story of a breakdown. Not just Prince Harry's, but a breakdown of trust, family, and silence. A breakdown that began long before the headlines, long before the Netflix specials, long before the public fallout between two brothers who once called each other my best man. So let me ask you this. What happens when the royal mask slips, and we see what's underneath? Because for the first time in years, Prince William isn't just wearing the uniform of a future king. He's speaking like a brother, a scared, angry, grieving brother who just watched the man he grew up with get wheeled into a hospital under sedation. And no one saw it coming. But maybe we should have. Let's rewind. Because to truly understand what happened 1 minute ago, the confirmation, the hospitalization, the whispered admission, we have to pull back the curtain on what's been brewing for years behind closed palace doors. A royal rift, or a time bomb. They said it was just a feud. Some called it sibling rivalry. Others dismissed it as overblown tabloid drama. But those who know, those who've worked within the palace walls, tell a very different story. One of whispered panic, midnight phone calls, strategic distancing, and more importantly, a prince slowly unraveling under the weight of two worlds. On one side, Harry, exiled, outspoken, defiant. On the other, William, stoic, silenced, restrained. Two halves of a royal coin. But over the last year, something shifted. The silences became longer, the statements sharper, the public appearances colder. And then, Harry disappeared from public view. At first, it looked like a retreat. Maybe time away from the press. Maybe a vacation. But behind the scenes, there were whispers. Whispers of panic, of sleepless nights, of mental collapse. He just shut down. Sources close to the Sussexes began leaking quietly to international press outlets, hinting that Harry had gone dark. Calls weren't being returned. Messages left unread. Aides were told not to disturb him. At first, Meghan thought it was grief. The stress of the lawsuits. The bitterness of being cut off, financially, emotionally, from the only family he'd ever known. But it was more than that. He just shut down, one anonymous source said. It was like he disappeared inside himself. Even she couldn't reach him. Now let's pause here. Because this isn't just a celebrity story. This isn't about castles and crowns. This is about a man, a husband, a father, a son, losing himself in the storm. And no one noticed. Or worse, some noticed and turned away. Why now? Why did it all implode now? That's the question everyone's asking. Why would Prince Harry, the man who walked away from the monarchy with his head held high, who rebuilt his life in California, who seemed freer than ever, suddenly crumble? Was it something said? Something done? Or was it something that never came? An apology? A reunion? A hand reaching back? Because here's the truth no one talks about. It's not always the trauma that breaks you. Sometimes, it's the silence afterward. The silence of waiting for a phone call that never comes. The silence of knowing your brother stood by while the press shredded your wife. The silence of hearing your father praise the crown, but not you. And now, that silence has broken. He's not okay. Prince William's words weren't meant for the cameras. They weren't part of a statement or a PR strategy. They were overheard in a corridor of a private mental health clinic just outside London. William, coat soaked from the rain, eyes red, stood quietly with his back against the wall. And to the only person in the room with him, one of Harry's doctors, he said, "He's not okay, and I fear he won't be for a long time." No title, no press, just two brothers, the air between them heavy with what was unsaid. But what triggered that moment? Was it the letter William brought in his hand? Was it something Harry said under sedation? Or was it guilt? Years of words left unsaid? You're about to find out. Because in this documentary, we're not just retracing Harry's breakdown. We're diving deep into what led to it. The betrayals, the battles, the haunting memories of Diana's final days, the press conspiracies, the legal threats, and yes, even the palace staff recordings that are now starting to leak. You'll hear stories of brothers once inseparable, torn apart by duty, media, and pride. You'll hear about the letter. Yes, the letter William brought with him that day. The one allegedly penned by King Charles. The one Harry read before collapsing. You'll hear about Meghan's silence, and why it's being called strategic by some and heartbreaking by others. You'll hear about Queen Camilla's shocking private remarks, caught on a recording device accidentally left on by a staffer. And you'll hear, in William's own words, the final conversation he had with his brother before the breakdown. But first, I want you to think about this. If your own brother broke down in front of you, eyes hollow, hands trembling, completely unrecognizable, what would you say? Would you bring up the past, the pain, or would you finally say the one thing you never could? Because that's what William had to decide. And what he said next changed everything. And what William said next changed everything. But here's the question. What do you say to a man who's broken and doesn't want to be fixed? What words are left when every bridge has been burned, every olive branch snapped in two, and every memory you once shared now feels like a ghost you can't touch? That's the position Prince William found himself in, staring through the frosted glass of a private hospital room. His brother inside, sedated, his own reflection staring back at him, pale, hollow, uncertain. It wasn't just about Harry. It was about everything that came before this moment. Every headline, every argument, every look across the room at royal events where the two couldn't even meet eyes. And now, all of that tension had finally exploded, silently, tragically, into a hospital ward reeking of antiseptic and shame. How did we get here? Rewind just 3 weeks. Harry had been in California, mostly off the radar. No Netflix interviews, no speeches, no press runs, just silence. And that's when people started to worry. At first, insiders thought it was calculated. Maybe Harry was preparing for a legal counterattack, or perhaps he and Meghan were building something behind the scenes. A documentary, a deal, a tell-all memoir part 2. But then, Harry started missing calls. Even from Meghan. He wasn't sleeping, aides later revealed. He'd started pacing at night, talking to himself. He'd forget simple things, like what day it was, whether he'd eaten. One source close to the Sussex camp said, it wasn't like him. There's dramatic Harry, and then there was this. This was something else, something darker. And Meghan? She was trying, but it was getting harder. She was worried, but also exhausted, said the source. She's been carrying the weight for a while. With the lawsuits, the kids, the image, she didn't expect him to unravel so fast. But unravel he did. Until one night, Harry collapsed. No public 999 call. No paparazzi chase. Just a desperate rush to a private clinic in Los Angeles. One known for handling celebrity psychiatric cases discreetly. And that's when William got the call. The phone call that changed everything. It came at 2:14 a.m. London time. William was asleep. Or trying to be. The news had broken hours earlier about another potential lawsuit involving Harry and a British tabloid. The palace had, once again, issued a no comment. But this call wasn't from a journalist. It was from a mutual contact, one of the few left who hadn't taken sides. You need to come, the voice on the line said. It's Harry, and it's bad. For a moment, William didn't speak. Was it a prank? Another trap? A leak waiting to happen? But something in the man's voice changed him. A crack, a fear, a truth. And just like that, William made the decision that shocked his own staff. He boarded a jet. Not a royal one. Not a public one. A quiet, chartered flight. No press. No security detail. Just him, his coat, and a single letter in his inside pocket. The letter he carried. We'll come back to that letter, because what was written inside it will hit you like a brick. But right now, let's stay in that moment. Picture it. Prince William, future king, slouched in an airport lounge chair in silence. No aides, no press, no flashing cameras. Just a man, quietly clutching a document from his father, one he didn't write, but agreed to deliver. What do you think he was thinking? Was he worried? Guilty? Or did part of him feel relieved? Because here's a brutal question. What happens when the black sheep finally breaks, and you no longer have to pretend he's okay? That's the shadow nobody talks about. The strange, twisted relief in family conflict when the drama becomes someone else's crisis. But if William felt that relief, even for a second, it didn't last. Because what he saw at the clinic changed everything. The room no cameras saw. No gold-trimmed hospital wing. No royal crest above the door. Just a plain white room. Fluorescent lights. Monitors beeping. And there, surrounded by nurses, an American therapist, and one deeply worried security guard, lay Prince Harry. His eyes half open, lips cracked, muttering something under his breath that no one could understand. A nurse told William, quietly, "He hasn't spoken a full sentence in 2 days." That's when William dropped the royal posture. He sat. He leaned forward. He took his brother's hand. "Harry," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Harry didn't respond. And that's when William, overwhelmed and unprepared, said the words we opened with. "He's not okay, and I fear he won't be for a long time." It was raw, unscripted, and it didn't matter that a staff member in the hallway overheard it. Because in that moment, William wasn't speaking to the public. He wasn't even speaking to Harry. He was speaking to the little boy in his memory. The one who walked behind their mother's coffin with him. The one who used to make jokes when palace dinners got too stiff. The one who, despite everything, was still his brother. But then, the shift. They say breakdowns aren't loud. They don't always look like screaming or violence. Sometimes, it's just the stillness. The vacant eyes. The silence. But then something changed. Harry stirred. His eyes opened fully. He looked at William. There was a flicker of recognition. And that's when William reached into his coat and pulled out the letter. A simple envelope. Unmarked. But what was inside, and who wrote it, sent Harry into a spiral. Because this wasn't just a letter. It was a line in the sand. And what Harry read made his hands shake. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What was written in that letter, and why did it make Prince Harry break down in silence? That's the question that haunted everyone in the room. The moment Prince William slid the envelope into Harry's trembling hands, time seemed to freeze. The beeping monitors didn't stop, but the air in the room thickened, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Harry stared at it. His fingers hesitated, and for a moment, no one knew if he'd even open it. But then he did. Slowly, carefully, as if part of him already knew what was inside would shatter the last piece of hope he was clinging to. And it did. Because the letter wasn't from William. It was from King Charles. And it wasn't a letter of love. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a message of fatherly concern. It was a warning. A final, royal warning. Buried in formal language, polished phrasing, and just enough distance to make it sting. But buried within it was a single handwritten sentence. Just one, scrawled in Charles's unmistakable pen. And that one line, that was the crack. The crack that would become a collapse. Let's walk through what really happened. The crown comes before the child. That was the line. 6 words. But they hit like a bullet. Harry's eyes widened. His lips moved as if repeating it to himself. And then he just froze. William watched his brother shrink inward. Not in the way a man grows small, but in the way a soul pulls back from the world, 1 inch at a time. A nurse reached toward Harry. He flinched. His chest began to rise and fall faster. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. That's when the doctor stepped in and told William to leave the room. And he did, but not before hearing Harry's voice, finally, for the first time in days. "He chose the crown over me again." Why did Charles write that? Let's back up. Because this letter didn't come out of nowhere. You see, in the weeks leading up to Harry's hospitalization, something big was brewing behind the scenes, a shift in legal dynamics, inheritance discussions, and public image management. Things the palace handles quietly, behind velvet curtains, using silence as a sword. But this time, it was personal. Reports suggest that King Charles was preparing for a major royal transition, possibly assigning future responsibilities, re-evaluating security entitlements, and, most controversially, rewriting parts of his private will. Why? Because of fear. Fear that Harry might leak again. That another book, another lawsuit, or another damning interview could explode the already fragile monarchy. So Charles did what monarchs have done for centuries. He used a pen, but instead of sealing it with a wax stamp, he handed it to William. "Give this to your brother," Charles allegedly said. William read it. Twice. And according to a palace insider, he pushed back. He argued. He called it unnecessary and cold. But Charles insisted. He needs to understand his place. Now more than ever. And so, The future king became a reluctant messenger. But here's the contradiction, the one that's tearing this family apart. If Charles really wanted peace, why send a letter so cold it could freeze fire? Was it strategy? Fear? Revenge? Or did he genuinely believe that reminding Harry of his role, or lack thereof, would somehow help him recover? No one knows. But one thing was certain. Harry didn't take it as clarity. He took it as betrayal. The unspoken truth. William agreed with him. Here's the part no one reports. When William walked out of that hospital room, he didn't go straight to the car. He sat on the bench outside for over an hour. Alone. According to a witness, a hospital staffer who recognized him but never approached, William was visibly emotional. Hands clasped, elbows on knees, eyes locked on the ground. He didn't look like a prince. He looked like a man who had just watched his brother break under the weight of something he'd helped deliver. Because deep down, William knew. He knew Harry hadn't just lost his footing. He'd lost faith. In the institution. In his father. And maybe, even in his brother. And here's the kicker. William didn't disagree with what Harry felt. Not fully. Because part of him, buried beneath the duty, the loyalty, the stiff upper lip mask of monarchy, part of him was just as angry. Angry that the crown keeps swallowing the people he loves. His mother. His brother. And now, maybe even himself. But here's the difference between them. Harry runs. William stays. And neither one can understand the other. The real meaning behind the letter. Let's take a look at what we know was in the letter. Multiple sources confirm it wasn't long. Roughly 2 paragraphs. It began with formalities, the kind of language only royalty uses when pretending things are fine. My dearest son, I hope this letter finds you in stable health and spirits. But the subtext was brutal. Charles went on to explain that recent developments, ongoing litigation, media appearances, and strained public perception had forced his hand. That security funding, property entitlements, and private estate shares were now under formal review. That last part stung. Because while the public believes Harry's been cut off, there are still murky layers of legal and financial entanglement. Trusts, land, legacy assets. And with one line in this letter, Charles had essentially severed the final financial tether, while framing it as a necessity, not a punishment. But the last line wasn't typed. It was handwritten, slanted, hasty, and devastating. The crown comes before the child. It wasn't meant as cruelty, perhaps, but it landed that way. Because for a son whose life has been defined by abandonment, first his mother, then his family, then his country, those 6 words were a guillotine. And they didn't just cut. They confirmed what he'd feared for years. That no matter how far he ran, or how loud he spoke, the man he still calls Pa would always choose the institution over the individual. And what does that do to a man? What does that do to someone who already feels lost? It breaks him. The fallout in real time. Back at the hospital, Harry wasn't just emotionally spiraling. He was showing signs of psychological distress, deep dissociation, paranoia, severe anxiety. According to insider reports, he repeatedly asked if the cameras were on. If they were listening. Who's they? A doctor asked. Harry didn't answer. But William knew. Because for years, Harry has lived with the weight of invisible watchers. Not just the press, but palace insiders, leakers, strategists. People paid to watch him. People paid to silence him. And now, it was all crashing down. William tried to stay longer, but the doctors urged him to leave. And when he stepped outside, reporters were already circling. The story hadn't leaked yet, but they knew something was happening. And when one dared to ask, "Is your brother okay?" William didn't answer. He just kept walking. But inside, something had shifted. He wasn't just worried for Harry. He was angry. Because for the first time in a long time, he agreed with him. The crown had come before the child. And maybe it always would. But what William did next, after boarding the plane, after landing back in London, after speaking to his father, would send ripples through the palace like never before. And no one saw it coming. But what William did next would send ripples through the palace like never before. So what did he do? He broke the rules. Not the written ones. Not the ancient codes embroidered into royal traditions. But the real ones. The unspoken laws that govern every word, every move, every carefully curated image of the British royal family. He called a lawyer. Harry's lawyer. Not the palace legal team. Not the crown's barristers. but an independent legal expert from Harry's circle. Someone William had been warned, more than once, not to associate with. Why? Because William needed answers. And for the first time, he wasn't trying to protect the monarchy. He was trying to protect his brother. But what he found out, he wasn't prepared for it. Because behind the headlines and public statements, Harry wasn't just unraveling emotionally. He was under legal siege. And almost no one knew. The legal avalanche. Let's unpack this. In the last 6 months leading up to the breakdown, Prince Harry's legal situation had quietly spiraled out of control. Publicly, most people only saw a handful of lawsuits. A case against the Mirror Group, ongoing friction with the Daily Mail, a privacy claim here, a defamation case there. But behind the scenes, it was much darker. Harry was at the center of a multi-pronged legal attack. The kind that doesn't just come from tabloids or social media smear campaigns, but from powerful institutions and former insiders who knew where to twist the knife. According to a high-level leak from within the UK legal system, Harry had been subpoenaed in multiple civil cases involving data breaches and libel, threatened with deposition in a US-based investigation tied to corporate partnerships gone sour, warned of a potential tax investigation related to unreported royal trusts and cross-border assets, and possibly most damning of all, named in a sealed document involving an investigation into misuse of royal charitable funds, an investigation with international reach. And through it all, one thing became clear. The pressure wasn't just legal. It was strategic, because legal war isn't always about winning in court. Sometimes, it's about breaking someone before the trial begins. Was Harry being targeted? Now, here's where it gets murky. Some believe these legal moves were organic, fallout from years of public statements, lawsuits Harry initiated himself, and the complexity of operating in both US and UK jurisdictions while still tied, in part, to royal legacy. But others? They believe it was coordinated. Whispers inside the Sussex legal camp spoke of unusual alignments. Cases that emerged simultaneously, shared legal representation across opposing parties, leaked documents that only palace insiders would have access to. And then there's the money trail. One case, previously buried under anonymity clauses, involved a former royal aide who had sued Harry for breach of contract. The case was dropped mysteriously just days before a major royal event. The aide was later seen entering a private function at Sandringham. Coincidence? Or payoff? And if payoffs were being made, by whom? Harry, in his fragile state, began to question everything. Every email, every phone call, even Meghan's role, or absence. This brings us to one of the most controversial layers of this storm, Meghan's silence. At the height of Harry's legal panic, Meghan reportedly stepped back from the situation. Not publicly, but privately. Sources close to the couple say the stress of the lawsuits, combined with financial pressure from canceled deals and the internal strain of Harry's worsening mental state, had pushed Meghan to a breaking point of her own. She couldn't be his therapist, his lawyer, and his wife all at once, said a friend of the couple. And when he started spiraling legally, she focused on the kids. Was she wrong to do so? Some in the public say no, that Meghan did what any mother would, protected her peace and her children first. But others argue it left Harry more isolated than ever. And isolation is where paranoia breeds. Because in the absence of support, every call feels like a trap. Every silence feels like a betrayal. And Harry began to feel surrounded. William starts asking questions. So now imagine William, freshly returned from California, letter delivered, watching his brother break down in real time. And now imagine him learning, for the first time, the full scope of Harry's legal nightmare. He was livid, not just at his father, not just at the firm, but at himself. Because William realized something sickening. He had no idea how bad things had gotten. He'd dismissed Harry's early lawsuits as tantrums. He'd waved off the press feuds as media manipulation. And worst of all, he believed the palace insiders who told him Harry was being dramatic and fine. But Harry wasn't fine. He was cornered. Legally, emotionally, psychologically. And William? He'd stayed silent. So for the first time in years, he made a bold move. He contacted a private solicitor. One with access to international court records, cross-border communications, and regulatory filings. And what he saw in the files, it broke him. The email nobody saw coming. One document in particular stood out. It was an email traced back to a private legal office with historical ties to the monarchy, dated 6 months earlier. Subject line, HRE, containment strategy. The contents of that email were vague but pointed. It outlined reputational risk assessments, optics management, and possible deterrent actions. Deterrent actions? That's not legal language. That's chessboard language. The kind used by institutions who see people as pieces, not sons. And William knew what it meant. This wasn't just about lawsuits. This was about control. And Harry? He was the target. But why? Why would the palace, or someone close to it, want to legally destroy a man who had already walked away? Was it about punishment? Was it about fear, that Harry still had more to reveal? Was it about control of the narrative? Or was it something even colder? Elimination through exhaustion. Because if you can't silence someone, you bury them in paperwork. You drain their money. You isolate their allies. And you let them collapse quietly. Which is exactly what happened. The turning point. So here's the cliffhanger. William, sitting alone in a conference room with Harry's legal files sprawled out in front of him, picked up his phone. He didn't call Charles. He didn't call Kate. He didn't even call the palace's crisis team. He called the press. More specifically, a veteran journalist. Someone William had once trusted before everything went sideways. Someone who still owed him a favor. And what he said was simple. You didn't hear this from me, but check your inbox in 10 minutes. He hung up. Then, he did something no future king has ever done, at least not in modern memory. He forwarded an internal palace legal memo to an outsider. Not to expose Harry, but to protect him. Because if the palace wanted a legal war, William had just fired the first shot. But what that journalist would do next, and the backlash that would follow, would spiral into a media explosion the palace hadn't prepared for. And once the story hit the front page, there would be no turning back. What kind of silence screams louder than words? That's the question people were asking as Prince Harry's hospitalization dominated headlines and royal watchers scanned every screen, every feed, every source, for one thing. A statement from Meghan Markle. But it never came. No tweet. No Instagram post. No official release from Archewell. No photos of her visiting Harry in the hospital. Not even a vague thoughts and prayers soundbite. Just silence. And that silence? It echoed like a thunderclap. Because in a world where every celebrity comment is dissected, where every royal reaction is measured in seconds and analyzed by PR experts, Meghan's silence was an absence. It was strategy, or heartbreak, or both. And depending on who you ask, that silence was either the most powerful thing she's ever said, or the most damning. Whereas Meghan, that was the headline flashing across screens from London to Los Angeles. The first 24 hours after Harry's breakdown were chaos. The media didn't know whether to treat it as a scandal, a tragedy, or a public relations crisis. The palace was scrambling. William was unusually open. Charles, according to insiders, had gone radio silent. But Meghan? Nowhere. Even friends who typically spoke on her behalf, stylists, activists, former Suits castmates, had nothing. Was she avoiding the media? Protecting her children? Or was something else going on entirely? Because according to one source who allegedly worked with Meghan's inner circle on past PR campaigns, she wasn't unavailable. She was watching. Closely. Silently. Deliberately. And that silence, the source claims, wasn't a delay. It was a choice. But why? And what was she waiting for? Meghan the strategist. Let's talk about the Meghan most of the public doesn't see. Not the victim. Not the Duchess. Not the mother smiling in carefully lit Instagram photos. The strategist. Meghan Markle is no stranger to media manipulation. She studied it, lived it, mastered it. From her early Hollywood days to the Netflix megadeals, she's built a brand as precise as it is profitable. And silence? It's one of her most powerful weapons. When timed correctly, silence can avoid committing to a narrative too soon, create suspense and curiosity, force other parties to speak first, buy time to assess legal risk, amplify a future message tenfold. And let's be clear, Meghan knows this. In past crises, she's used silence like a scalpel. Remember when the British tabloids tried to spin her crying at a bridesmaid fitting? She said nothing, until months later in that Oprah interview, where she flipped the entire narrative and claimed Kate was the one who made her cry. Silence gave her control. Timing gave her impact. So if she's using the same playbook now, it begs the question. Is she protecting Harry or protecting herself? Or is it grief? But here's the contradiction that makes this story so messy, so human. What if it's not strategy? What if it's pain? What if Meghan isn't staying quiet to manipulate perception, but because she doesn't know what to say? According to someone allegedly close to the Sussex household, Meghan has been through hell watching Harry decline. Not just emotionally, but physically. Insomnia, panic attacks, sudden weight loss. She tried everything, the source said. Therapy, retreats, even meditation workshops. But he just kept spiraling. And when he finally collapsed, she blamed herself. That's not PR. That's heartbreak. And maybe, just maybe, her silence isn't a tactic. Maybe it's a scream. Inside the Montecito walls. So what was actually happening behind the walls of their Montecito mansion in the days leading up to Harry's hospitalization? Reports suggest that tensions had reached a boiling point. One staff member, speaking anonymously, revealed. There were raised voices, doors closing. Meghan was trying to manage 2 kids, a stressed-out husband, and multiple cancel media deals. She was barely holding it together. Sources describe a household in emotional lockdown. A place once full of optimism and rebranding energy now reduced to hushed conversations and redacted schedules. The Netflix follow-up deal? Delayed. The Spotify contract? Gone. The upcoming public appearance at a women's empowerment summit? Canceled without explanation. And then came the breakdown. Harry was reportedly found unresponsive in his home office. It was Meghan who made the call. And that's what makes her silence even more puzzling and painful. She was there. She saw it all. So why hasn't she said a word? The voicemail. Here's where it gets even more complicated. According to a leaked tip, Meghan did leave a voicemail for someone on the royal side after Harry was hospitalized. Who she called is still unconfirmed. But multiple sources suggest it was Princess Anne. Why Anne? Because Anne is neutral. She's never been a public antagonist. She doesn't leak. And she's known to be quietly sympathetic to Harry, even when she disagrees with his decisions. The voicemail, according to an insider who claims to have heard a partial transcript, said this. I'm asking you as a woman, not a royal. Please. He needs help. It wasn't polished. It wasn't calculated. It was raw. And it raises a haunting possibility. Was Meghan's silence not a shield, but a surrender? Did she realize that speaking out publicly might do more harm than good? Or was she simply begging the one person left in the royal circle who might listen? And if that's the case, why didn't Anne respond? Or worse, what if she did, and it was too late? The inner circle fractures. Here's something even more alarming. In the days following Harry's hospitalization, 3 staffers reportedly quit Archewell, all within 72 hours. And while the official reason was burnout and career change, multiple outlets have begun digging deeper. One tabloid claimed a moral divide had developed within the team, some urging Meghan to speak out immediately to defend Harry's image, and others warning her to wait and avoid legal entanglements. One former PR strategist allegedly said, if she speaks too soon, she risks contradicting medical reports. If she speaks too late, she looks cold. She's in a no-win scenario. And that, perhaps, is the perfect summary of the silence. It's not just a pause. It's a trap. The world reacts. Of course, the internet didn't wait for facts. Within hours of the news breaking, hashtags like #WhereIsMeghan and #StandByHarry started trending. Opinions were split. Some demanded her voice. She fought for him before. Why not now? She's his wife. Say something. Others defended her fiercely. Leave her alone. She doesn't owe you anything. She's probably traumatized too. But here's the truth none of the tweets captured. When a loved one suffers a mental breakdown, there is no script. There is no right way to grieve, to respond, to breathe through the chaos. And for Meghan, a woman so often accused of saying too much, maybe saying nothing is the most human thing she could do. But what she did next, that changed everything. Because Meghan finally emerged from silence, not in a press statement, not in a sit-down interview, not even in a video. She made one move, one single move, that sent a shockwave through both the media and the palace. She boarded a plane, but it wasn't headed to London. It wasn't headed to the hospital, and it wasn't what anyone expected, because Meghan wasn't running to Harry's side. She was flying away from him, and where she landed, would ignite the next firestorm. What do you do when the place that once called you family pretends you never existed? That's the chilling reality Prince Harry faced in the days after his hospitalization. Because while the world scrambled for answers, while Meghan disappeared into silence, while William broke every rule to stand by his brother, the palace went cold. No statement, no visible concern, no public message of support, not even a flag flown at half-mast at Clarence House. The symbolic gesture that normally accompanies royal illness or tragedy. Just silence. And not the kind that brings comfort. The kind that feels like abandonment. Calculated. Surgical. Ruthless. The kind that says, you are no longer one of us. The protocol machine. To understand how the palace works, or doesn't work, in moments like this, you have to understand one brutal truth. Emotion doesn't live in the institution. Protocol does. Behind those grand gates and gold-trimmed doors is a machine. One that doesn't feel. It calculates. It measures optics. It drafts carefully worded statements, and then redrafts them 30 more times before a single word sees daylight. So when news of Harry's hospitalization broke, the royal comms team didn't jump into action. They froze. Not because they didn't care, but because they were terrified of saying the wrong thing. One misstep could validate Harry's criticism of the firm. One phrase could legally entangle the crown in a medical matter they had no jurisdiction over. One public admission could paint the monarchy as complicit in his decline. So what did they do? They did what they always do when someone becomes a liability. They turned off the lights, shut the curtains, and waited for the storm to pass. But the problem was, this time, the storm wasn't outside. It was inside the family. The do not comment order. According to multiple royal correspondents, palace aides were immediately issued a Level 2 DNC directive, short for do not comment. A rare internal classification used only in situations where potential fallout includes legal, emotional, or constitutional risk. Level 1 is for scandals. Level 2? That's for implosions. And make no mistake, they considered this an implosion. Harry's breakdown, his silence, William's transatlantic trip, Meghan's disappearance. All of it combined into a public relations nightmare no royal playbook had prepared for. So the official strategy? Say nothing. Show nothing. Feel nothing. One aide reportedly summarized it this way. Until we know how bad it is, we don't move. Not a tell. But while the palace stood still, the people noticed. The headlines grew sharper. The public grew louder. How can they ignore this? Would they do the same if it were William? Where is King Charles? And that last question? That one struck a nerve. The king's disappearance. Because when the public asked, where is Charles? No one had an answer. At the height of his son's crisis, King Charles reportedly left Windsor and flew to his private estate in Scotland. No press. No announcement. Just gone. Why? Some say he was overwhelmed. That the stress of the situation, combined with the pressures of aging, pushed him to seek solitude. Others say it was strategy. That his advisors told him to be out of sight to avoid questions. But a few whispers inside the palace suggest something colder. That Charles couldn't face the fallout. Because he already knew what was coming. He knew about the letter. He knew William had delivered it. And he feared what would happen if the public found out just how cold that letter had been. Because if the monarchy is built on image, then Charles knew one thing above all else. A father turning his back on a son in crisis doesn't photograph well. Camilla's private words, caught. And then came the leak. A private moment. A careless comment. A staffer's device accidentally left on during a room sweep. According to a report from a former palace protection officer, Queen Camilla was caught speaking privately with two senior advisors just hours after Charles had retreated to Scotland. She didn't know she was being recorded. And the snippet that leaked? It wasn't kind. She reportedly said, "He's always been dramatic. This isn't new. He'll recover, or he won't. Either way, it's not our problem anymore." Let that sink in. Not our problem anymore. That line spread like wildfire through the royal reporting underground. At first, no major outlet would touch it. The source was too risky, the implications too explosive. But then a former aide, now working as an anonymous contributor to a major tabloid, confirmed the tone of the conversation. It wasn't said with malice, they claimed. It was said with exhaustion, like someone tired of walking on eggshells. But to the public, it sounded like cruelty, dismissal, abandonment. And when it leaked to select journalists, including the one William had contacted earlier, the story was already beginning to build. Camilla's words were the match. The media's anger? That was the flame. And the palace? Still said nothing. William's frustration boils over. Back at Kensington Palace, William was livid. Sources say he had returned from California with a plan, a quiet strategy to begin repairing the relationship with Harry in private, while gradually preparing the public for some kind of reconciliation. But instead, he found a palace stonewalling any effort at compassion. Every time he brought up Harry in meetings, he was met with blank stares or changed subjects. "Do not engage," one aide reportedly told him. "This will pass." But William wasn't interested in letting it pass. Because in his mind, this refusal to feel, to acknowledge, to care, was the very thing that broke Harry in the first place. So he broke ranks. He told a journalist, the same one he'd contacted before, that if the palace didn't issue some statement of compassion, he would. That threat sent panic through the halls. Because a statement from William, unapproved, unsanctioned, would be a direct challenge to the king's authority. But what they didn't know was, William had already drafted it. The statement that never made it. The draft was short, raw, honest. It read, "In times of pain, we must be family first and titles second. My brother is unwell. He needs support, not scrutiny. I ask for privacy, not just for him, but for all of us. We are human, and right now, that's all that matters." It was ready to go. William's team had already set up the media blast. Press contacts were primed. But then the call came. From Charles. No assistants. No intermediaries. Just father to son. He told William in no uncertain terms, "If you send that statement, you will be removed from succession talks." It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. And for William, that was the line. He didn't send it. But from that moment forward, the palace didn't just feel cold. It felt hostile. The family had chosen the crown. Again. But this time, William was keeping score. And what he did next would fracture the firm in a way not even Diana could have imagined. What do you do when your home no longer feels like home? When every hallway whispers betrayal? When every ancestral portrait seems to judge you? When even the crown you're meant to inherit feels like a cage? You escape, but not just anywhere. You go to the one place where memory still feels like comfort. And for Prince William, that place was Sandringham, a sudden departure. It wasn't planned. There were no pre-scheduled engagements, no press pack notified, no security detail briefed ahead of time. It was a disappearance disguised as a trip. Late at night, after a terse conversation with Charles that ended in veiled threats and constitutional ultimatums, William ordered his team to ready the chopper. Destination? Sandringham House, the Norfolk estate where generations of royals had spent Christmases, hunted grouse, and posed for painfully formal portraits. But this trip wasn't about tradition. It was about reflection, and maybe rebellion. Because what William was wrestling with wasn't just grief over Harry's condition. It was the crushing realization that the family he'd spent his life defending, upholding, shielding, had once again proven itself emotionally bankrupt when it mattered most. So he flew away, not to abandon duty, but to remember why it once mattered. Sandringham, the ghost house. Sandringham isn't just an estate. It's a palace of memory. It was here that William and Harry played in the snow as boys. Here that Diana would sneak them into the kitchens late at night for cookies. Here that the boys, just days before Diana's death, spent their last real weekend of childhood joy. But now, it was empty, quiet, cold. Staff had been sent away. The property wasn't prepped for guests. And yet, William insisted on staying in the smaller guest wing. The one he and Harry used to sneak into as kids to avoid royal formality. One staffer, speaking off record, said William arrived carrying nothing but a duffel bag, a copy of a book on his mother's life, and a sealed envelope. Not the one he'd given Harry. Another one. And this one, it was from Diana. Or at least about her. The forgotten drawer. Let's pause here. Because what William discovered next was never meant to be found. Or perhaps, it was meant to be found only when the time was right. While walking through the halls of the private library, a place rarely used since Charles's ascension, William noticed something strange. A low drawer beneath an antique secretary desk was slightly ajar. Not locked, not sealed, just open a crack. And inside, dozens of old photos, family relics, clippings from the tabloids. But one photo stopped him cold. It was a candid shot, unposed, grainy, black and white. Diana sitting on a bench, holding Harry at age 4, William's arm around her shoulder. Written on the back, in Diana's unmistakable handwriting. He's sensitive, more than he lets on. One day, he'll need you to fight for him. No date, no context, just that one line. And William? He dropped the photo. Not from shock, from guilt. Because that day, the day Diana predicted, had come. And William had nearly let his brother die under the weight of silence. Diana's presence. We often romanticize Diana, the people's princess, the royal rebel, the shining light in a cold institution. But to her sons, she was more than that. She was warmth. She was laughter. She was protection. And Sandringham was the last place they had her all to themselves. Sources say William spent hours walking the estate grounds that night. No security, no aides, just boots crunching in the frost, breath steaming in the cold air, and memories pressing in on all sides. He stood under the same willow tree Diana used to sit beneath when she needed quiet. He revisited the lake where they once fished. And then he cried. Not the restrained, single-tear royal kind of crying. Real sobbing. A local groundskeeper reported seeing him from a distance, doubled over, hands on knees, shoulders shaking. Alone. At Sandringham. The future king, completely undone. And that's when he made a decision that would turn the royal family upside down. The phone call. Shortly after midnight, William made a single phone call. Not to Charles. Not to Kate. To an archivist. Specifically, the woman responsible for maintaining the personal journals and letters of Princess Diana, kept in a temperature-controlled vault on private royal grounds, known only to a handful of people. He told her what he found in the drawer, told her he wanted access, told her he needed to know if Diana had written more. Her response? She wrote everything, especially about you two. Within hours, arrangements were made. And the next morning, while the world still had no idea where William was, he was sitting in a secure room, holding a binder marked DS, Confidential, 1991 to 1997. Inside, dozens of notes, letters, musings, unsent messages, some addressed to friends, others to herself. But at the center of it all, a section titled, If They Turn on Each Other. Let that sink in. Diana anticipated this. She feared that the crown, the same one that crushed her spirit, would one day pit her sons against each other. And her words? They weren't poetry. They were warnings. William will protect the crown. Harry will protect the heart. The institution will try to make them enemies. If I'm not there, someone must remind them. They are not each other's threat. William sat in that room for 4 hours, reading, rereading. And when he emerged, he looked different. Not broken. Determined. Because now, he knew what had to be done. Not for the crown. Not for the palace. For Harry. A plan forms. Back at Sandringham, William started drafting something. Not a speech. Not a statement. But a manifesto. A document that would, if released, reshape the monarchy's entire approach to family, privacy, and public accountability. He titled it simply, The Human Clause. And its purpose? To create a formal internal guideline requiring royal response to mental health crises within the family. Not PR response, not silence. But actual, documented action, psychological support, mediation, communication. It was unprecedented. It was bold. And it was completely unofficial. Because if William wanted it approved, he'd need the council's blessing, the king's signature, the press office's spin. But he didn't want approval. He wanted impact. And so, he started calling allies. Not royal ones. Human ones. Therapists. Veterans. Charitable leaders. Childhood friends. And to each, he posed the same question. If a royal broke down, how should the family really respond? The answers flooded in. And so did support. William was building a coalition. One rooted not in bloodline, but in empathy. And that's when news broke of Meghan's secret flight. She wasn't going to London. She wasn't going to the hospital. She was flying to Scotland. And her destination? Balmoral. The ancestral home where Queen Elizabeth died. The place where Harry last spoke to his father in person. And when William heard this, he smiled. Because it meant one thing. Meghan had her own plan. And what came next would bring them face to face again. For the first time in months. What if she saw it all coming years before anyone else did? Before the headlines, before the betrayals, before the breakdown? What if Princess Diana, in her quietest moments, behind palace walls, out of public view, began to map out the tragedy unfolding now? Because what Prince William uncovered in that binder in Sandringham wasn't just heartbreaking. It was prophetic. And now, it's unraveling in real time. Diana's secret writings. Let's start with the truth few know. Diana was a writer. Not of novels or political essays, but of reflections, deeply personal, often chaotic, sometimes brilliant entries written in small journals, loose letters, even napkins hidden in books. Many of these writings were quietly preserved by a trusted friend, someone Diana met through her charity work, someone who wasn't part of the royal machine. This person, who remains anonymous by legal protection, was entrusted with copies of Diana's musings for safekeeping. Why? Because Diana feared the palace would destroy the originals. And according to those who've reviewed these documents, Diana knew her sons would one day need them more than the crown ever would. One journal, labeled the Rift Diaries in blue ink, contained an entry that would shake William to his core. Dated November 1994, the year after her separation from Charles, it read, "They'll use William's sense of duty. They'll use Harry's longing for love. And if no one intervenes, they'll weaponize one against the other." William read that line 3 times. And suddenly, everything made sense. Harry's exile, his breakdown, the coldness of the palace, Charles's calculated letter, Camilla's dismissal, even William's own silence. It had all been predicted by the very woman they both lost too soon. And the warning wasn't just a reflection. It was a call to action. Choose each other. Another letter, written in early 1996, months before the divorce was finalized, was addressed simply, "For them. If it gets dark." William hadn't known this existed. No one in the family had ever mentioned it. But it was real. Ink smudged. Edges yellowed. Pages creased from years in hiding. In it, Diana wrote, "If you're reading this, then the world has done to you what it did to me. Taken your love and twisted it into ammunition. Please, my sons, when they make you choose between the crown and each other, choose each other. The crown doesn't bleed. You do. Let that sink in. The crown doesn't bleed. You do." It was like Diana had reached across time to grab William by the shoulders and shake him awake. And awake he was. For the first time in years, William began to understand the full cost of royal duty. The quiet sacrifices, the emotional toll, the way the system turns brothers into figureheads, family into headlines, and breakdowns into inconvenient optics. But now he had her words. And he wasn't letting go. The interview they buried. In 1995, Diana gave her infamous panorama interview with Martin Bashir, a broadcast seen by millions around the globe. But what most people don't know is that a second interview was recorded days later. Unofficial, off the record, never aired. It was meant for archive purposes, a kind of emotional follow-up where Diana was encouraged to speak freely with no broadcast restrictions. That interview vanished, or so the palace claimed. But guess what William discovered? A transcript, tucked inside a sealed envelope within the vault of documents at Sandringham. Stamped confidential. Dated December 3rd, 1995. And in it, Diana said this: "My biggest fear isn't what happens to me. It's what happens to my boys when I'm gone. Because this place, it doesn't love. It consumes. And Harry, especially, he feels everything. He'll run. William will stay. And I only pray the world doesn't punish them for being different." Sound familiar? Now fast forward to today. Harry did run. William did stay. And the world? It's punishing both of them in different ways. But Diana wasn't done. Near the end of the transcript, she added, "If they ever turn on each other, it won't be their fault. It'll be ours." Meaning the system, the institution, the palace machine. And that idea, that accountability belongs to those who built the cage, stuck with William. Because suddenly, it wasn't about blame. It was about responsibility. His responsibility. The inheritance nobody talks about. Here's something rarely discussed in royal circles. When Diana died, she didn't just leave money. She left guidance. Through letters, diary entries, recorded conversations, she tried to arm her sons with the one thing the palace never gave her: clarity. And buried within those documents was something else William hadn't expected: a legal clause. written by Diana's lawyer in 1996. Inserted quietly into her estate terms, conditional upon extraordinary events of public mental collapse involving either of her sons. If triggered, this clause would allow the beneficiary, William or Harry, to override royal communication protocols for the purpose of releasing Diana's personal statements, recordings, or writings in defense of their well-being. In other words, if the palace ever tried to silence them, Diana gave them permission to speak. And now, it was triggered. Harry's condition, the palace's silence, William's discovery, all of it added up. And William realized something he never expected. He wasn't just protecting his brother. He was fulfilling his mother's dying wish. And then, a new voice emerged. As William sat with this tidal wave of emotional and legal revelation, news broke. A voice recording had leaked to the press. Not Diana's, not William's, not Harry's, Meghan's. A private voicemail. Allegedly left for Princess Anne, as hinted in Chapter 4, had surfaced in partial form and was now circulating among journalists. The line that stood out? You all saw him unravel. You all knew. And you said nothing. Diana would have never let this happen. It was raw, angry, real. And now? Public. Suddenly, Diana's name was back on the front pages, not in nostalgia, but as a reckoning. Journalists began pulling old interviews, reprinting quotes, analyzing body language, drawing connections between Diana's past warnings and Harry's current crisis. And William? He saw the headlines. He saw the growing wave of support. He saw the truth Diana had planted decades ago beginning to bloom. And he knew it was time. Time to act. Time to respond. Time to speak. Not as a prince, as a brother. But first, he needed to go back to the hospital, because there was something he had to tell Harry. Something only Diana could say. And now, only William could carry. What do you do when the truth is too painful to say out loud? So someone else says it for you. That's exactly what happened in the days following Prince Harry's hospitalization. As the media frenzy intensified, as William unearthed Diana's prophetic letters, as Meghan's voicemail leaked and rocked the palace from the inside, a new figure quietly entered the story. Not a royal, not a journalist, not even a friend, but a doctor. The one person who had sat with Harry, hour after hour, as he unraveled behind closed doors, far away from the flashing cameras and harsh tabloid headlines. And what that therapist put in writing wasn't just clinical, it was damning. Because behind every polite phrase and carefully chosen word was the one conclusion the palace had spent years trying to avoid. Harry's breakdown wasn't sudden. It was engineered. The report that was never meant to be leaked. Let's be clear. This document wasn't written for public eyes. It was a confidential mental health assessment, standard protocol for any high-profile patient admitted under emotional duress and psychiatric risk. But someone leaked it. A hospital insider, frustrated by the royal silence, angry that the truth was being buried behind photo ops and vague denials. They smuggled out a summarized version of the report, not the entire file, but enough. Enough to burn. Enough to reveal what Harry's team had tried to protect, and what the palace refused to acknowledge. And now, it was in the hands of journalists. And William. So what did it say? Let's break it down. The diagnosis. The report didn't use sensational language. No tabloid-style outbursts. No exaggerated predictions. Just this. The patient is experiencing a sustained emotional collapse triggered by prolonged exposure to institutional stress, familial estrangement, and unresolved grief compounded by persistent media persecution. Let's pause. That line, just that line, speaks volumes. This wasn't just burnout. This was systemic destruction of mental stability. The report went on. Symptoms include dissociation, intermittent paranoia, persistent insomnia, and episodes of depersonalization. Translation? Harry wasn't just sad. He was breaking away from himself, losing touch with reality, drifting in and out of clarity like a man caught between worlds, his past trauma, his present silence, and a future he couldn't trust. The cause? There is a strong correlation between the deterioration of the patient's condition and recent developments related to family communications, legal threats, and public scrutiny. The message was clear. This wasn't just psychological. This was personal. And every trigger had a royal fingerprint. William reads the report. It was couriered to him discreetly. A brown envelope, unmarked, slipped through his security detail at Kensington Palace late at night. It wasn't stamped with hospital insignia, but William knew what it was the second he held it. He took it to his study, sat alone, opened it with shaking hands, and read. He read Harry's symptoms, the emotional regression, the isolation, the night terrors. He read how Harry would flinch at loud noises, convinced the paparazzi were outside, even when alone in a soundproof room. He read about the flashbacks, of walking behind Diana's casket, of fights with Charles, of a particular moment at Balmoral when Harry said, "I'm not him. Stop trying to make me into someone I'm not." And then came the final note, buried at the bottom of the report in bold. The patient repeatedly cited a belief that his family is more concerned with legacy than with his life. That line, it undid William. He put the report down, sat in silence. He'd just come from Sandringham, where he'd read his mother's warnings. He'd seen her pleas to protect Harry, to put family before the firm. Now here was clinical proof that no one had listened, that everything she'd feared had come true. And Harry? He wasn't just spiraling. He was slipping away. The confession. What Harry said in therapy. The most haunting part of the report wasn't the symptoms. It was the confession. Because at one point, during a lucid window, Harry had spoken. Just once. Just long enough. And the therapist wrote it down verbatim. "I feel like I don't exist unless I'm being punished. If I'm quiet, they forget me. If I speak, they destroy me. It's like they've decided I'm not their son. I'm the leak. I'm the risk. And it's easier to let me disappear than to love me." Read that again. Not just a cry for help. A resignation. A man who